We'll have Ian Wilson, who is a writer and historian who lives in Bozeman. Wilson is endlessly curious about the times gone by, which drives his passion for research and writing. And he's the author of the forthcoming Montana Historical Society press book, Catastrophe at Custer Creek, Montana's Deadliest Train Wreck, which is in final production as we speak. For magazine fans, an excerpt prepared in the summer issue. So that's what you get to look forward to. All right, I'll turn it over to Ian.
Good afternoon. In between you and cocktail hour, so I will definitely stay on time here. So I want to thank Jeff and Diana DeStefano, publisher, publications manager at the Historical Society, for taking an interest in my story, and which is a Montana story, of course. And as it turns out, the accident at Custer Creek was the worst train accident in the state's history in terms of loss of life. And but over the years, plenty has been written about this accident, mostly in newspapers and some articles and that kind of thing. But I had to dig deeper when I tripped across this article about 5 years ago or so, and there are plenty of very interesting backstories, people stories, family stories that make this a much bigger picture and a much bigger story than it was. So, so anyway, let me get organized. And as Jeff mentioned, the summer version of the Montana magazine, there is an excerpt about the story itself. Let me put that on. Let's start. So, you know, this is a period where steam locomotives were still blazing the trails on the rails across Montana and the rest of the country. This is in the 1930s. This accident happened in June 1938. And let's see here. Here we go. And of course, it's a story about the Milwaukee Road Railroad. And this is a map showing the railroad itself and the expansion. It was quite a big player. It's got its start, of course, in Milwaukee in the 1850s. Had some very inspired leadership with their organization and grew massively. By about the turn of the century, 1900, that is, they had about almost 7,500 miles of owned rail across the United States, but they were up against other major railroads, and including the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and other railroads like that too. And I'll make a note here too. I'm sure there's people in the audience here that have forgotten more about railroads and locomotives than I know. So I learned a lot in researching this book, but it's just fascinating history. So, so the Milwaukee Road, in order to stay competitive with the Great Northern and with the Northern Pacific, decided in the early 1900s, 1906, announced a plan to expand to the west, to grow to the Pacific. And the Missouri River, is this the pointer here? Which one is that? Very top. Oh, at the very top. So where's the Missouri? Right above the yeah. Well, no, this is west eastern Montana, right in here. Right, but above the box. Oh yeah. But the expansion really was from the Missouri back over here to all the way over to Tacoma. They called it the Puget Sound Extension. And they did it to stay competitive and also to stay independent. They were a fiercely independent organization and wanted to stay relevant in the railroad world, which was getting increasingly difficult. So they decided to do that, and they came all the way across. They actually built this extension, which was well over about 1,200 miles in 3 years, which is pretty extraordinary. And they started, and that was in 1906. They finished in 1908, put the Golden Spike in 1909, and started passenger traffic on there. And so one of their earlier passenger trains on there was called the Olympian. And the Olympian started rail traffic through there in 1911 through Montana. And it did it for many decades. And it ultimately was the pride of the Milwaukee they call it the Milwaukee Road. It had many different names: Chicago, Milwaukee, as you can see on the little sign here. Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. But they ended up shortening the name to the Milwaukee Road in the 1920s, the mid 1920s. But so the Olympian was kind of ahead of its time, and the railroad was a technology leader as well. They were highly innovative. They had their own shops. They built their own cars, their own locomotives, most of it in Milwaukee, but ultimately in Miles City as well. And they were a leader in providing electric lights in their cars, air conditioning, steam heat, roller bearings. They kind of led the way to make passenger travel at the time just fantastic. And not only was it luxurious and comfortable, but it was also affordable, pretty much to any kind of Americans at the time. So unlike my previous Chuck Rankin's, his journey across the Bozeman Trail, actually one of the things they were most proud of at the Milwaukee Road was their dining service on the train, which was first class. And it rivaled some of the best restaurants you could find in Chicago or Seattle or some of the other major cities. They had linen on the tables. They had their own custom china. They had cut flowers. And so on an Olympian train, they had about 190 passengers and crew together, but they served 3 meals a day, 3 calls for 3 meals a day. So in other words, 19 seatings in their diner car. So, and I should have provided a copy of the menu here, but very impressive. I mean, you wouldn't see those kinds of foods in restaurants even today in Montana. So, but very impressive service. So, so the Olympian itself, it traveled. They left Chicago at about midnight every night, and it took about 58 hours to get to Tacoma. And so, as one was leaving, they left every night. There was another coming from Tacoma to Chicago. So back and forth they kind of went. So at any one time, there could have been 6 Olympian flagged trains traveling back and forth between Tacoma and Chicago. So go with this. So one of the stations that they went through, and of course, this is about the stories about this too, is really the backstory about Miles City, which of course is a very quintessential railroad town. Of course, named after the general that fought at the Little Bighorn battle there, Nelson Miles. Miles City was the Northern Pacific first laid track there through there in the 1880s. And at about that time, there's only about 10 years later, there's only about 1,000 people in Miles City. The Milwaukee Road came through quite a bit later, 1906, 1907, and laid tracks through there. And it really became, even though the Northern Pacific was there, Miles City became a Milwaukee Road town. They kind of owned it in terms of the railroad, and ultimately they employed in the 1920s, there was about 8,000 people in Miles City. And interestingly, that's about what their population is today, 7,500. And about 1,000 people in Miles City, adults, worked for the Milwaukee Road Railroad. So it was really a major operation in that town. In addition, oops, let's go this way. Look at this. Oh, sorry, wrong one. There we go. This I showed you this back picture here shows it's probably in the 1920s. That's the Miles City Station right there. Very crowded. That is an Olympian flagged train coming through. And as you can see, it's I'm not sure if something special was going on, but there was quite a few people there that day. And this is another picture about Miles City, which it was also a division headquarters for the Milwaukee Road. Huge operations there. And I mean, the closest division to a Miles City was way back at the Missouri River in Mobridge, some 500 or 600 miles away. So it laid claim to having responsibility for a lot of the territory there. You can see here, this is a 24 locomotive roundhouse that they had here. It held 24 steam locomotives. They had metal shops. They had their own power plant. They owned their own coal facilities in Roundup, Montana, and they shipped the coal here. So just a huge employer. They fixed locomotives here. They repowered them, built their own cars, and it was just a major operation. So part of the story here associated with this is this picture kind of tells it all. This is eastern Montana, and it's an immigrant story as well. Thousands and thousands came in to Montana looking for cheap land, looking for an opportunity to be a rancher or a farmer, having no idea about the conditions and the hardships living on the high desert prairie out there. Very cold winters, very hot summers at times. And so by the time that this accident occurred, 1938, this is another picture. This is in Saugus. This is kind of, could have been a picture that Evelyn Cameron took, who was a photographer of fame out there in eastern Montana, but this is actually my photo. But it kind of shows how desolate it was out there. There's no trees and that kind of thing. But by the mid 1930s, this area was pretty hollowed out by by a combination of an unrelenting drought that went on for over a decade. The early part of the 1900s was wet, and then starting in about 1919, it got very dry for an extended period of time. The Milwaukee Road had a terrible railroad strike in the early 20s that let go a lot of people. Of course, they had pests and locusts and other things happening there too. So, but this picture here kind of talks about it. And in Saugus itself, where the accident occurs, even back then, it was a speck of a town. And at one point, it had a library and a schoolhouse and a post office, which was really a brand of legitimacy. If you had a post office, you were in business. If you didn't have your post office, you were like off the map. So by the time 1938 rolled around, their post office was gone too. So, but you can still find it on the map. It still exists today. So, so part of the most prominent family in Saugus that is still there today is the Hawkins family. And I had a great time interviewing family members there and talking to them about their back history. This is a picture of Dan Hawkins Jr., who will play a very big role in the rescue and recovery associated with the accident. His livestock ranch, which was founded in 1901, which is still in existence today. And then they actually own 250,000 acres in eastern Montana. They, great, interesting family. They have Irish roots. The family talked about the fact that nobody could ever pronounce their name properly. You know, Hawkins, but it's Hawkins, they're Irish. And his father, Dan Sr., homesteaded in this area, the Miles City area, between Miles City and Terry, up in the Big Sheep Mountains there, right along the Yellowstone River in 1901. There's a funny story. He came via the Yakima, Washington, and heard there was land in eastern Montana and came here. And he had, during this time here, he got settled, and then he went back to Ireland to get his bride. But he found out by the time he got back, she was already married to somebody else. So, being the enterprising person he did, he decided to marry his younger sister, Susan. And Susan Hawkins is her name. And she ultimately became known as Montana's favorite redhead in eastern Montana. And so she took a boat from Ireland to Liverpool to Quebec City, got on a train and went all the way over to Miles City to meet her new husband. And off the train there, and according to her family records and documents, when she got off the train and saw what she saw in Miles City, she said, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Because, you know, she was surrounded by bootleggers, and, you know, it was a pretty rough time in those times. So, but Dan Jr., the family farm is up in the Big Sheep Mountains, about 20 miles away from, actually at the headwaters of Custer Creek. And the son, Dan Hawkins Jr., moved down to the Yellowstone River in Saugus. So in the early 1930s. So let's go here. So the other story too is the Milwaukee Road is our friend here, the engineer, Frank Merrifield. Merrifield was a very veteran locomotive engineer based out of Miles City, been an engineer probably for about 30 years. In 1938, he was pushing 60. But he definitely had a twinkle in his eye. He had been married for the third time to a young woman who was about 25 years his junior. And another story came out in my research that because he did the milk run, he took the from Miles City, the eastbound Olympian to Chicago, all the way. He took it to Marmarth, North Dakota, about 124 miles. And then he waited for the day in Marmarth, North Dakota, and took the number 15 back to Miles City. So it was kind of a milk run. Probably 4 or 5 times a week he did this. And it was a prestigious job to lead the Olympian, because he could drive beasts like this S2 Northern type locomotive. And this was actually the locomotive, it was rebuilt, that was demolished in the accident, same one, and number 220. And 6 months before the accident happened, it was delivered brand new to the Milwaukee Road, and they put it on the rails. And this beast, 8 driving wheels, four on each side, cylinders, pistons the size of tree trunks. It was really built for freight, but in a pinch, they would make it, put it in to pull the Olympian itself. In the back there, the tender had about 15 tons of coal in it and 20,000 gallons of water to drive this thing. So again, this was the steam locomotive era. But the interesting part about, and you'll read more about it when you read my book when it comes out, Frank Merrifield, and the twinkle in his eye, had a lot of time to spend in Marmarth, North Dakota. And it didn't come out until his funeral, but another family came forward to collect from the Milwaukee Road the money they were handing out to their employees. So, and that was verified by his family as well. So anyway, he had other things in mind besides driving a locomotive, I guess. So, the other family stories that I get into here, and to me, this is the real fun part of it, because it was, you have all these different stories where you had, and this is pretty much in the accident itself, but the recovery, these families that were very much impacted by it here. These twins, I actually grew up in New Hampshire. These twins were Dean and Don Hanscom were from Dartmouth College. They were sophomores. They had just finished their sophomore year. They were on their way to Seattle to take summer jobs. They were on the train. One lives, the other one does not in the accident. This young family, the Lallis children here, this is Anna, John, and George. I interviewed George several times. He was 92 when I last talked with him. And the children survived the accident. They were on their way home from a trip around the world to Greece, going back to Bellingham, Washington. Both parents died in the accident. This young woman, Margie Clancy, just 19, she was being taken on a trip of a lifetime by her elderly aunts, Kate and Nell. They were from Bloomington, Illinois. They happened to get on what was later called the car of death, which was a sleeper car that just about everybody in that car died in the accident. Another great part of the story, and this is I apologize for the picture here, Chicago porter Lewis Williams. He was new to the job, 25 years old, football standout, big guy, you can tell by his shoulders there. He was in the sleeper car he was managing the sleeper car right behind the Shoto where Margie Clancy and her family were. He ends up rescuing everybody in his car before the car went off into the waters. So he came to be known the hero porter. The Hand McGuire's, George Hand was a policeman for the Milwaukee Road. He was waiting for his daughter, Florence, to join him in Miles City for the wedding of Irene Roberts Hands. And Irene Roberts Hands actually is from Helen and here, and I went to interview her. She died a couple years ago at age 104 about this visit of her sister and her parents. And Florence was a trained nurse from Miles City, but was in Milwaukee and was on her way back to her sister's wedding. She had a remarkable escape actually from the car of death, which they called it, and was able to crawl back. This is in the middle of the night, and she was ultimately saved by Lewis Williams before the car ultimately rolled into the water. And then finally, the Gehrigs from Minneapolis. Paul Gehrig was a railroad employee for the Milwaukee Road. They were on their way to Yosemite National Park, California, for a summer vacation, just like the Clancys were. And they play a very key role in the recovery and the rescue of passengers on there. They were on the middle sleeper, as they called it, and all of the families survived. This is an incredible story. So the weather, of course, plays a huge role in what happened in this incident here. There was a series of rolling thunderstorms. This is mid-June 1938. Lots of heat, lots of humidity, which was fuel for the storm. Ultimately, the storm, moving from west to east, landed in the Terry Badlands and hung out there for probably the better part of 4 or 5 hours on the Saturday night before the accident. And ranchers and witnesses thought they thought a cyclone associated with this weather. And one rancher reported in testimony afterwards that at his ranch, he had 6 inches of rain in 2 hours. So it just poured and poured. And it basically flooded all the creeks on the west side of the Yellowstone, including Custer Creek. And Custer Creek happens to go down to the Yellowstone, but the path that it travels goes through Saugus, right near Dan Hawkins Ranch, and goes underneath a railroad trestle. So this is a picture I have here. And this is, again, just a thumbnail sketch of what happened here. But this is a remarkable picture. This is a picture that showed up with a young photographer that actually was in Life magazine in July, probably 2 weeks after the accident. And this was taken at about 4 a.m. on Sunday, June 19th, 1938, just about 4 hours after the accident occurred. So it occurred in the middle of the night, worst possible time, people sleeping, dozing, whatever. And it shows here the picture of the first train to arrive, because back in this era, it wasn't like you could just turn on a diesel and get there. This was the steam era. They had no hot trains. It took them, the rescue teams, 3 to 4 hours to reach the accident with doctors and nurses and rescue people. And there was a lot of people that may have lived but did not as a result of that time frame. But the picture is interesting here. This is, you can see the Milwaukee Road sign on here. This is actually the Ipswich, which is the car that the Gehrigs were on, the Gehrig family. And you can see it's basically cracked in half here. They were sleeping in their berths and the roof cracked open, and they were inundated with hot coal and dust from the tender in front of them. And you can see this is the tender, the back of the tender, that huge tender that was holding 15 tons of coal. And on the other side, what you can't see there's two other, you can see a little bit on this side, there's two other coach cars in front of it, and then the demolished locomotive that was over here on this side. But this tender proved what happened was, in the middle of the night, you had 50 people in the night on top of these cars. They escaped through the windows to get up on top because the water was so vicious here. They were trying to get off, but they were not able to because this tender was in the way. But you can see this image here almost looks like rags. It's actually part of a wooden ladder that Dan Hawkins happened to have, who was the first responder to the scene, in the back of his truck. He is credited with saving 50 to 60 people because in the middle of the night, they clambered over this greasy, coal-slicked tender to get off to dry land. This is another, Custer Creek is usually a dry bed, like for almost the entire part of the year. And you can see the water here, just astounding amount of water that came down Titanic. And this is, I'll go back this one. This is Lewis's Williams cars, the porter from Chicago that rolled and flipped and everybody was out of it. This is the car that got caught, the Shoto, which ended up being the car of death, which had the Clancy sisters here. This is a piling from the bridge, which was destroyed. The next photo really shows the accident scene. So Custer Creek is flowing this way, and it flows into the Yellowstone River, coming down this way. And this is Miles Cities going this way. This is Terry up here. But there was really four parts of the accident. The first part, which I showed you, this is the Ipswich that we showed the other part of from this side. And you can see the other coach cars like crunched in there. This is the rolling post office that they had, which got slammed underneath the tender here. The locomotive got so demolished, it's amazing that they rebuilt it. But this is where the locomotive was. As I mentioned, the Gehrigs escaped from here. Hawkins' ladder allowed them to escape. This was the car of death. It got pinned on the west side of the current on this piling here, and just about everybody died that was on that. And then this is Lewis Williams's car too. That it fell, the bridge collapsed, and then the car rolled and came up, but everybody escaped onto the Terry side of the tracks. So this is another view. The recovery took about a week. Very painful. People from all over. Miles City was inundated from reporters and newspaper people from all over the world wanting to cover this accident. It was the worst accident in the Milwaukee Road's history. And this is a picture of the Shoto of what they had to do to try to get inside that car just to recover the bodies afterwards. Bodies were ejected. I'll go back to the other one. Bodies were ejected into the city, into the river here, and they found some as far down as the North Dakota border in the Yellowstone River. And they spent a week looking for bodies and that kind of thing too. So anyway, there's a lot more. That's a thumbnail sketch. That's the bridge at Custer Creek today that I took. Very peaceful looking place. And this is the book that's going to be coming out, I'm not sure, sometime soon in the couple months. Good Christmas present. So thank you very much.